Father Peter McVerry, I suppose the only surprise is that it's only one person dead.
Every winter you get a number of homeless people who die from the cold, basically, from the being outdoors. What was different with this man's death, Jonathan Corrie, was where he died. If he had died somewhere out in Tala, there would not have been this fuss, but that he died within 50 yards of the Doyle building, where they have consistently made no decisions in relation to homelessness. That's what generated all the activity now that's taking place this week.
And it would seem we're not a million miles away from the ability to resolve it. It's within the grasp of government politicians to do it. And you've spelled it out.
Some of it is. There are three problems. One is a long-term solution, putting homeless people into homes. Now, we got to build the homes, or we got to buy the homes. That's going to take time. So that's a medium to long-term solution. But there are two things that are urgently needed and that can be done immediately. One is to get people off the streets. That's not rocket science. You get a few buildings, you renovate them so as to give every homeless person their own personal safe space. You put beds in and you employ some staff. You could do that in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks.
If you wanted to. The second urgent and immediate problem is stopping people coming into homelessness. You know, we need probably about 300 emergency beds to be created. But unless we stop people coming into homelessness, we can take those 300 rough sleepers, give them emergency accommodation. There's going to be another 300 who have taken their place. Most of the people becoming homeless today in Dublin are being kicked out of the private rental sector because rents are going up and they can't afford them. And unless we tackle that problem, we have a flood of homeless people coming on. The official statistics in Dublin are that there are 6 new people becoming homeless every day.
And we saw it even this week, in the week of the death of Jonathan Corrie. We saw a family, a husband, a wife and a child, thrown out because the ESB was taking action against them and the sheriff's men went in.
That's right.
Thankfully, the people went back in again. They got reinstated in their home. That's only a short-term measure.
Well, what is of most concern today is the number of families becoming homeless. Focus Ireland, who are a voluntary organisation who primarily deal with families, they would say they deal with 7 or 8 families a month normally. Now they're dealing with 40 families a month, and last month there was 45 families. And for the first time in Ireland, probably since the famine, we now have families living on the street. Be aware of families who are living in cars, one family who goes out to the airport to sleep because it's warm, another family who put their children into care because the parents had to sleep on the street and they didn't want their children sleeping on the street. So that's the most shocking and horrifying aspect of the homelessness today, I think.
And we're a family nation.
Absolutely.
We remember. Our lives are family orientated.
But not only that, but we have all this child protection stuff in place, and this concern about protecting children and giving children whatever is necessary for a proper development. And yet we can leave young children, some of them on the streets, others in hotel bedrooms. 2 parents, maybe 2 children living in one hotel bedroom with no facilities to cook. You have to go out and buy chips for them every night, which cannot be good for their health. No place to play. Your development is stunted if you're living in an hotel room for any length of time, and some of the families have been there for over a year. It is absolutely, and the stress that puts on families. I dealt recently with one man whom I know. He rang me up. He was in an hotel room with his children and his partner, and he said, "We've just split up." The stress was causing rows between us, and eventually it just erupted, and he left. He was looking for his bus fare to get out to the airport where he could sleep for the night.
Peter, what are the politicians doing? Because, for goodness sake, you're identifying something that can be encompassed, held on, put on a shelf, identified and sorted. Why aren't they doing it? It's as you say, not rocket science.
I think there's a number of reasons. One, I think they're looking for a cheap solution to homelessness, and there isn't a cheap solution to homelessness. The Taoiseach said recently that it's not just about money. Well, I mean, I'm sorry, but it is just about money.
Yeah.
You know, putting people into emergency accommodation is about money. Keeping people in their private rented accommodation is money. And building homes is money. It is about money. It's not just about bricks and mortar. Some homeless people, but they're only a minority, some homeless people have an addiction problem. Some have a mental health problem. And in order to deal with that, we do need services. But that's money as well, helping people to deal with their addiction and their mental health. The addiction services are hopelessly inadequate. The mental health services down there are, if you're poor, are absolutely appalling. So at the end of the day, I say to the Taoiseach, sorry Taoiseach, this is about money. You're looking for a cheap solution to homelessness, and a cheap solution doesn't exist. The other problem is the attitudes towards homeless people. The perception is that homeless people are addicts, or that they have mental health problems, and some of course do. And the reason why that perception exists is because they are the only homeless people who are visible. They're the ones on the streets, and you know, most homeless people are invisible. We have homeless people going to third level education. We have homeless people becoming electricians and carpenters, but they're invisible. You don't see them. And so the perception, which the politicians share, the perception of homeless people is that they have an addiction or that they have mental health problems, and therefore the attitude is, well, they're low priority. Why would we bother investing substantial sums of money in people like that?
And not only will we not invest money in them, we will avert our gaze. We shall not speak to them. We do not say good morning, good afternoon, how are you? Would you like a cup of coffee? That's a basic development. If it occurred, it would start a kind of movement of change, maybe.
It would. I always say that. People often ask me, should you give money to people who are begging? And I say, look, I don't know. Sometimes I think you should, sometimes I think you shouldn't. But what you can do is stop and say hello.
Yeah.
And that's far more important than giving the money. And I told that to a group of women once, and a woman came up to me sometime later in the street and said, I was at that talk and I heard what you said and I decided I'd try it. So I was walking along with my little 3-year-old son. We saw a guy begging, and I gave my son €2. And I said, now I want you to go up and put that €2 into the cup in front of that man. So up they went, and she started talking. Hello, how are you? Freezing cold. How's business? A little bit of small talk. And then she said, look, my son has something he wants to give you. The little fella went up and put the €2 into the cup. And the homeless man put his hand in his pocket and he took out a Mars bar. And he said, and I have something I want to give your son. Now, he was responding there not to the €2, though he still made a profit. But he was responding to being treated as a human being. And that is because we do tend, and people will say that, as soon as they become homeless, the attitudes change towards them, and they feel as if people are treating them as scum and as low lives, and that's the hardest part of being homeless.
I was talking to 2 homeless men last Saturday, and they called me and they said, look, what kind of glass is this? And they produced a little cheap candle holder. And they said, is it blowing? I said, no, look, you'll see the rim on it. There's the rim. It's dropped and it's molded, and that's it. Ah. And one looked at the other and he said, will we? And the other said, okay, we'd like to give you this as a present. That's
nice.
my Mars bar story.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's happening. It happens all the time,
It does.
you know,
It does.
all the time. But I mean,
people are so grateful for the little you do. When you have nothing, people are just so grateful for the little that you do. And above all, when you're treated with disrespect by most people, for somebody just to treat you with respect lifts your heart, it lifts your soul, and you really do appreciate it.
Is there anything lifting your heart and lifting your soul? Because you've been swimming against the current ever since you first walked into Ballymun and settled there.
Well, it's homeless people who lift my heart and lift my soul. I mean, I'm surrounded by them all day long.
You are.
And they do express their appreciation, so, you know, in so many little ways. The little you can do for them means an awful lot to them. Sometimes somebody will come in to me and they'll sit down, they'll talk for 20 minutes, and they'll pour out all the woes. And at the end of it, I say, look, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. I mean, there aren't any beds available. You're probably going to have to sleep on the street tonight. but they'll go away saying, well, thanks very much for listening.
Oh, absolutely.
Just to sit down and listen to them for 20 minutes means a lot to them. Shows that they are important to you, shows that you care, and communicating that to homeless people is just so important.
Yes, and as they go about their day-to-day business, some are broken beyond repair. Some will never smile again, but others on day one will be grumpy and want to kill you. But by Friday, the smile is there, and they don't want to kill you. It's a roller coaster for folks.
Well, we all live day by day, and every day there's little joys that bring a smile to your face, and there's sorrows that put you down. Probably for homeless people, there's far more sorrows than joys. But nevertheless, every day there are those little moments of joy, of encouragement, of hope that spring up, and that's very important that they experience that, and that they respond to that.
They're talking in Dublin this week and the week after the death of Jonathan Corey. They're talking about what's possible, what can be done. To what extent and how are you hopeful?
Well, there's never been this much interest, shall we say, political interest in homelessness. Unfortunately, it's a response to a death, and unfortunately it may dissipate just as quickly once the memory of Jonathan Corey's death dissipates. But I would be quite confident something's going to happen. There's a big meeting. The government are having what they call a forum, and Dublin City Council are having an alternative forum, and I've no doubt something has to happen. They cannot have a forum and nothing happen. That would be the worst of every possible world. So something's going to happen. I presume something will be in the line of providing more emergency accommodation. Will it be enough? I don't know.
It's interesting.
If I'm going by their history to date, it won't be enough.
Yeah,
they're going to do the minimum. They're going to do what the minimum they can get away with, basically.
That's painful to listen to. That the minimum that they can get away with. Have they not learned any lessons, Peter?
It's about money. It's about money.
But
and
I mean, money.
Ultimately, it's about values. Yeah. And unfortunately, the values aren't going to change overnight. And the government will be looking at how can they address this problem without adding to the government debt, basically. So we don't want that's why they've never increased the rent allowance. People are losing their flats because they can no longer afford to pay the rent, because the rent subsidy they get from the government is too low, and they can't afford the difference.
To put the money right, it wouldn't put the country out of business.
It wouldn't, but it would add 50 million to the government debt, and that they're absolutely determined this is not going to happen. So they're adamant they're not going to increase the rent allowance. They've set up a committee to look at the whole rent allowance scheme, and that committee is to report back in January, but that's just kicking the ball down the road. They're adamant they don't want to increase the rent allowance. Because that will increase the government debt, and they're going to have to find the money somewhere else to compensate. So they really are very resistant. But unless they increase the rent allowance or introduce rent controls to prevent landlords upping the rent by 250 or 300 euros next month, we're just going to have this hemorrhage out of private rented sector into homelessness, and you can open all the emergency hostels you want, but there's going to be a flow of people into homelessness, all needing more emergency hostels. And in actual fact, it is very expensive keeping people in hostels.
Of course it is.
In hostels you have to staff them, at least 2 staff 24/7. It costs in the region about 35,000 euros per year to keep one homeless person in a hostel.
But you in part summed it up when you talked about to ensure that each homeless person had his own or her own personal secure space to sleep in.
Yeah.
That seems a fundamental thing, and if the government don't want to spend the 50 million, don't want to add that to the debt, what's stopping them putting a a ceiling on what the landlords can do, saying to the landlords, you must not do this. You must have a ceiling to your rents. Why not?
Well, the landlords will have them in the High Court in the morning, saying this is we have a constitutional right, it's our property, we can do what we like. However, you could bring in a 6-month ceiling, rent freeze, that's what I would be advocating, emergency measure to deal with an emergency. And by the time they get you into the High Court, the 6 months will have passed. So
we are the art of the possible.
So that's the
this is the way forward there.
But a lot of the emergency accommodation that exists, and this is my fear, a lot of the emergency accommodation that already exists is dormitory style.
Yeah, and people don't want to go into
and it's
dormitories.
first come, first served. You have drug users, active drug users, you have career
Shooting
criminals, absolutely, in the middle of the night. You have career criminals in there who will, if you're vulnerable, they will intimidate you, they will threaten you, they will rob you. Many people won't go into those. And my fear is that in order to save money, whatever new emergency accommodation they introduce will be of a similar nature. I absolutely object to that. I think if we're going to respect the dignity of homeless people, then we have to help them to feel safe. And so for me, the bottom line is that each homeless person has their own personal space where they can go in through their own door, lock the door, know they won't be assaulted during the night, and know that their belongings are going to be there in the morning. The biggest complaint I get from homeless people who come into our drop-in centre is they woke up this morning, the 5 people they were sharing the room with are gone, so is their money, so is their mobile phone, so is their runners, so is their methadone, everything of value is gone. And they come into me in total despair. So this idea of sharing accommodation without doing some sort of assessment as to your needs, where you put non-drug users in with drug users, where you put vulnerable 18-year-olds in with 35-year-olds who have been in prison all their lives, that sort of response is absolutely hopeless. And I said, look, they'd be better off sleeping on the streets.
Yeah, and there is the indignity of people phoning up the free phone number. They're kept waiting, they're maybe 50th in the queue.
That's right.
They're kept waiting to be told whether they have a bed for the night or not.
One lad rang from my office, they often ring from my office, one lad rang from my office, he was on the phone for 1 hour and 40 minutes before he got through to speak to somebody. He got into a computer and he was told, you're 42nd in the queue. And then actually, I don't know what went wrong, but he got down to about your 2nd in the queue. And he was absolutely delighted. And the next minute, a voice came from the computer saying, you are 25th in the queue. Whatever happened. But that's so frustrating. And imagine if they didn't have my phone, if they were using their own mobile phone, so the battery would be dead. Or if they were using a pay phone, sure, you'd be standing there in the pay phone for 1 hour and 40 minutes, absolutely frustrated. Then they take their frustration out on the poor person who answers the phone. And then the person who answers the phone takes their frustration out on the client.
Calling, yeah.
And so it's a total disaster situation.
Peter, hold that thought. We'll be back in a moment. Father Peter, we've defined the problem. You've been constantly trying to resolve it. You're there all the time. You're in the midst of the homeless people in Dublin, and it's a never-ending task for you. You have positioned yourself as there. Well, you haven't. The natural world surrounding you propelled you into the position of being their champion. You had no choice. You couldn't have walked away because of values. And we talked about values a moment ago. It seems to me that the politicians who don't want to solve this are flying in the face of their values, family values that they grew up with in Ireland. They went to church, they went to chapel, they went to school, good, decent parents, but yet they're saying, we will not change things. Their values have become skewed.
Well, I think that might be a little bit harsh. I think politicians do want to change things. Nobody wants to see families living on the street. Nobody wants to see people living on the street. But the ultimate value comes down to money. I always say if there was a foot and mouth disease in the morning somewhere down in Kerry, there would be a crisis cabinet meeting. They wouldn't set up a committee to report back in 4 months' time. There would be decisions taken at that cabinet crisis meeting, and we would be told that money is no object. We have got to resolve this foot and mouth. It is too serious. The economy of Ireland is at risk. Homeless cattle and sheep are more important to the economy of Ireland than homeless people, and that's the bottom line. It's money at the end of the day. They're not. They would love to have no families living on the street. They're embarrassed by families living on the street, but are they prepared to commit the funding to ensure that that will not happen, just as they would commit the funding to dealing with a foot and mouth disease? And that's where the breakdown occurs. And I don't think they even see it in terms of values, but people are more important. The economy is for people, not people for the economy. And I think that's the way we're running this country, that what's important is the economy, and people have got to ensure that this economy continues and continues successfully. I mean, right, we had a crisis, a banking crisis, and we had a huge big debt. The priority was to clear that, was to get our economy back on track. And people were to be sacrificed to get the economy back on track. And people were sacrificed in so many children were sacrificed. Funding for traveller children, for example, to keep them in school was withdrawn. Child allowance was withdrawn, even from poorer families. People and children were sacrificed in order to get the economy back on track. And I think that's a perversion of values.
Absolutely.
The economy is for people and not people for the economy.
Tell people about your friends, the homeless folk of Dublin. What are they like? It's a bit. It's like asking me the question, what are the people in Newry like?
Yeah.
They're like everything.
That's
They're
right.
a mixture of everything.
Homeless people span the whole spectrum.
Is there a warmth in your heart for these people?
There's a sadness for them, because many of them are, most of them are very fine people, some of them very damaged people because of their childhood experiences. But many of the homeless people we deal with are going to go on and have very successful lives. Some of them go to third level education. Some of them became electricians and carpenters and bricklayers. One during the Celtic Tiger years had his own little construction company, employed 10 or 12 people building houses. Now that's collapsed. But he still maintains his own property maintenance company. He's self-employed and he's doing extremely well. But as I say, they're the invisible homeless. You don't see them. Then there are the other homeless people who are very damaged. Very damaged by their childhood experiences. They've had horrific experiences, perhaps of abuse at home, of violence at home. We had a lad who used to flee from his father's violence. He'd go out into the back garden and hide in the dog's kennel for hours on end when his father became very violent. We had other young people who weren't wanted at home. The door was slammed. One young lad, 14 years of age, the door was slammed in his face every time he went home. He was told, "You're not wanted here." How do you cope with that at 14 years of age? Other young people whose parents were drug users. One lad, I brought him down to a treatment centre some time ago, but he was telling me on the way down that, when he was 13 years of age, he'd sit in the kitchen every night watching both his parents injecting heroin. He had no chance, absolutely no chance in life. So many of these homeless people are people who have had no chance. They're wonderful people. If they had lived in different circumstances, they would be doctors and lawyers and probably politicians as well.
I was in a certain situation a week ago, and I think this little story, this little cameo demonstrates that not everyone within homelessness is an addict to drugs, whatever. And I'm just doing my duty, I'm keeping going, I'm moving along, and the lady leaned forward to me and she simply whispered, "They're shooting up in the toilet." That's all she said.
Yeah.
Now, that triggered a response that allowed something to be done about that.
Yes,
and it was done.
Yeah.
And then another lad who, he had a bottle of medicine. Yeah. And he was down, I think, to 500, he said. I don't know the terminology or the measurements. But he said, and look what they've given me. And he was angry and he was shaking. He said, it's 550 and it shouldn't be that. He was taking a pride in that he had got down to 500 and that the doctor had given him the wrong prescription.
Yes, yeah.
And he was so proud that he was making headway.
Yes, some homeless people have a drug problem. A minority of homeless people have a drug problem. And if we really want to address homelessness, then we have to address drug issues. Now, the drug services in the Republic of Ireland are hopelessly inadequate. The ones that exist are very good and give a very good service, but they're hopelessly inadequate in terms of the extent of them. There are long waiting lists frequently. There are an estimated 20,000 drug users in the Republic of Ireland. We have 35 detox beds for 20,000 heroin users. You can be waiting months to get into a detox bed. And of course, when a drug user wants to come off drugs, and every drug user I have ever worked with wants to come off drugs at some point in their life, you have a window of opportunity, 6-8 weeks maybe, to help them begin at least to take the steps to get off drugs. If they go on a 6-month waiting list, they become demoralized, they become fed up, and they give up trying. And so when we have a hopelessly inadequate drug services, we are condemning people to remain on drugs for the rest of their lives. In many parts of Ireland, there are no drug services. You might have to travel 60 miles to get a drug treatment service.
Peter,
I buried 2 young people a few Christmases ago.
Yeah.
And they were both, I knew them both very well. They both died of a drug overdose. One had been found dead, ironically, on Christmas morning. And they were both on the waiting list for one of those 35 beds, but they didn't have time to wait. So we really destroyed their lives by not providing the services. So if we are going to help people to deal with the personal issues that they have, whether it's addiction or mental health, we've got to provide services. We've got to provide proper services. Again, that's very expensive. The treatment of drug users down in the Republic of Ireland is give them methadone. Give them methadone for the rest of their lives. You're not solving their addiction problem. No. Methadone is more addictive than heroin. But you're solving society's problem. They're not going out robbing to pay for their drugs, and they're not turning up in A&Es with serious drug-related health problems. So you're solving society's problem, but you're not solving the addict's problem, and therefore, and that's our response to that. A drug user is seen as equivalent of somebody who has diabetes. Somebody who has diabetes, give them their insulin, give them their needle, and they can inject themselves every morning and lead a normal life. Somebody has a drug problem, give them methadone every morning, they can lead a normal life. And that's the attitude, I think, towards drug use amongst the medical profession down in the Republic of Ireland.
Peter,
but it's not what drug users want. They call methadone liquid handcuffs. They feel trapped by their addiction to methadone.
Peter, could you still say your prayers?
I do, irregularly, but I do.
Yeah, but your prayers are your hands, your feet, your mind, everything you're doing is your prayer.
Yes, but I think you do need to take a little bit of space, and
That's
you
the
do
Jesuit in you coming out.
and you do need to connect
Yeah.
with a being that I call God. Other people might call it something else, but I think you do need to take that space.
It is
And for me, my relationship, those homeless people have changed me totally.
Yeah.
One of the things they've done is they've changed my relationship with God. I mean, I grew up thinking God was a judge. God was up there looking down at you, and everything you did and said, and even everything you thought, you would one day going to have to go before God and account for it. I just reject that notion of God now, the notion of God as a judge.
He wouldn't be a very busy God if he was picking out our foibles. He would have
Well,
very little to be doing.
Well, he would be very busy, actually.
He would indeed, picking out our foibles.
But I don't think I don't think God's interested.
Not there,
Not interested in
No,
that.
no.
So, for me, God is compassion.
Yeah.
God is love. God is compassion. Young people come to me and say, "Look, how do you know there's a God?" And I say, "I'll tell you how you know there's a God." Imagine somebody sitting at a lakeside, at a riverside, and enjoying the peace and the calm and the quiet. And there's a little kid playing beside him, and the little kid falls into the river, and he jumps into the river, and he pulls the little kid out, and he saves the kid's life. What will the parents of that child do? Well, first of all, they'll go to the hospital or wherever and make sure that their child is all right. What will they do after that? They'll want to meet you. They'll want to find you to thank you personally for saving their child's life. So I say to young people who don't believe in God, there's no point looking up into the clouds because you won't find God there. Look around you. Look around you at the suffering of people. Every one of those people suffering is God's child. You reach out and take some of that suffering off their shoulders. What will God do? God will want to come and find you. God will want to thank you personally for what you have done for God's children. And when God finds you, then you will meet God, and then you will know that God exists. So it's about reaching out to taking some of that suffering, and there's so much suffering in our world today, taking some of that suffering off people's shoulders, and that's the most important thing you could do for God. The thing God wants most of all from all of us. I always say God's dream, Jesus' dream, which is God's dream. Jesus' dream was that we would have a world where no one was hungry and wasn't being fed, where no one was thirsty and wasn't being given water, where no one was naked and wasn't being clothed, where no one was in hospital and wasn't being visited, and so forth, as we find in the last judgment scene in Matthew's Gospel. Jesus' world is a world where every one of God's children can lead a happy, peaceful life. I think we are all here to try. What unites us as Christians particularly is not that we obey certain laws and rules and precepts. What unites us as Christians is that we share Jesus' dream of building a world where all God's children can live together in happiness and peace and together in harmony. And if we share that dream, then we've got to work to try and make that dream become a reality. We look at our world today, 1 billion people living on the edge of destitution. Every one of those 1 billion people is God's beloved child. That's not what God wants for them. No parent wants their child to be living in destitution. And God wants us to do something about that. God wants us to live together as the family of God. If you had a family, 4 children, parents don't give 3 of the children a big steak for their dinner and tell the 4th child, here, you can have bread and jam. Family shares what they have, and everybody shares what's available, whether it's a little or whether it's much. And yet, as I say, in our world, the family of God condemns 1 billion people to the bread. If they even had bread and jam, they'd be very lucky. And in a family of 4, their parents don't give 3 of the children a nice, comfortable bedroom and tell the 4th child to sleep outside the front door on the porch.
Or in the
family
kennel.
The family shares. If they've only 1 bedroom, the 4 children share the bedroom. Everybody shares what they have. And yet, in our world today, in every city of the world, there are people sleeping on the streets. So, for me as a Christian, that's what defines me as a Christian, that I share God's dream, Jesus' dream, and that I commit myself to trying to make that dream a reality.
Father Peter McVerry, thank you for focusing my dream today. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.